We're speaking with Murray Waas. Murray Waas has written extensively on Iraqgate. He was a special correspondent with the Los Angeles Times and has written an in-depth story on Iraqgate for the New Yorker magazine, and we all know where that's based. Murray Waas, thanks for joining us on this special devoted to scandals of the Reagan-Bush era.
Thank you.
And I think perhaps a good place to start with you, because you've done so much investigating on Iran-Contra, and now you are knee-deep, if not deeper, in Iraqgate. Why don't you, just before we get into exactly some of the details of Iraqgate and the relationship between Iraqgate and Reagan-Bush administration, why don't you talk about where these two scandals come together?
They're both Iran-Contra and Iraqgate are part and parcel of a conduct of foreign policy in a way in which two presidents, Ronald Reagan and George Bush, conducted their affairs while in office, and they both constitute what ultimately, I think history will show, but I think has been already documented, was a type of government that was extra-constitutional in nature, that was conducted outside the law, that was secret from the American people, and exempt from congressional oversight because Congress was simply not told. And this has been a dramatic departure from the way, from the practices, the traditional practices that we adhere to the concept that this country is a constitutional democracy. These people decided that they didn't want to be constrained by the law, by the rule of law, by the constitutional system, and so they took an entire foreign policy and said we alone or have the sole right to decide what it is, conduct it in secret, and do it in such a way as they were almost dictatorial in the manner that they conducted it. They set aside the concept that the American people and Congress or representatives have a right in saying and determining what the foreign policy is. That the foreign policy, too, if I can add, is about half of what the government does. It does domestic policy and foreign policy, and for Congress and courts and everybody to just cede foreign policy to the president is really a dangerous precedent. It's the American people. Somebody saying for the American people, you don't have a right to determine your future. You don't have a right to determine foreign policy that might or might not lead to war. What we seem to forget is that all these scandals have had a consequence on the daily life of the average person, and each one of us have been denied the right to determine our own future. With Iran, we had arms sales for hostages that led to an escalation in the Iran-Iraq war, which helped cause our own war with Iraq. With Iraqgate, we had a covert policy to build up and arm Saddam Hussein, which then ultimately made him the fourth largest military power in the world, and which really gave him the confidence and military might to then invade Kuwait and go to war with us and our allies.
Well, in a moment, after we talk a little bit about the details, I'd like to come back and talk about the real impact. We can talk a little bit more about how suffering was caused by this policy, both abroad and in this country. Marray Waas, let's take a look at Iraqgate, what's now being called Iraqgate. And what I'd like you to do, first of all, is assess the boundaries, the parameters. What is this scandal? How do you assess this scandal?
Iraqgate was one of several covert foreign policies by the Reagan and Bush administration, and that was to tilt towards Iraq in the Iran-Iraq war. And it wasn't a single policy. There were different factions in the Reagan administration. Some backed the Iran side, some backed the Iraq side. And those who backed the Iraqi side advocated and conducted the secret policy to assist Saddam Hussein in his war against Iran.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about exactly what happened. And perhaps a good way to come at this, maybe a way to understand what happened, is perhaps to examine the role of first Vice President Bush and then President Bush in a very thorough way in terms of his behavior and his actions in what we're calling Iraqgate?
There were a number of things that were done by the Reagan administration to help and prop up Saddam Hussein during the Iran-Iraq War, and George Bush played a central role in a number of them. There was an effort during the war by the Reagan administration to help Saddam Hussein build something called the Aqaba pipeline, which was going to be a pipeline built from the interior of Iraq to the Jordanian point of Aqaba, which would then take Iraq's oil to give it a port to take its oil to the west. And with the increased oil revenue from the pipeline, Iraq would be able to buy more arms and defend itself much better against Iran. And so the Reagan administration had a covert initiative to get financial backing, diplomatic backing, make the Aqaba pipeline a reality. And George Bush was called in at a central time to get the U.S. Export-Import Bank to finance the building of that pipeline. The Export-Import Bank didn't want to finance the pipeline essentially because according to its own statute and according to its own regulations, it's not supposed to give loans when there's what they call a, quote, reasonable assurance of repayment. And they did a study and found out that Iraq had no chance in hell, really, to repay the loan. So the bank initially refused. George Bush, who was a classmate at Yale of the president of the bank, called the president of the Export-Import Bank, and the Export-Import Bank, contrary to its own roles and also contrary to the law, did a 180-degree turnaround based on this one phone call from the vice president. So that was one key thing he did.
I wanted to keep talking. I mean, there are many things that George Bush did, and I really would like to get a sense of his role throughout the entire affair, both as vice president and president. So take a few minutes and detail that.
Another thing he did as vice president was the U.S. wanted to economically assist Saddam Hussein, and the U.S. Export-Import Bank provides loans to companies money to do business overseas, and we had cut off credit to Iraq. We stopped bank loans to Iraq because of its involvement in terrorism, its bad human rights record, and so the Reagan administration wanted to open up the credit, wanted to provide more of the credit. And so George Bush, again, as vice president, intervened with the bank in an effort to get the bank to open up billions of dollars of new loans to the regime of Saddam Hussein. When Bush became president, he continued a number of economic incentives or economic assistance to Iraq. He continued and increased Export-Import Bank assistance to Iraq. There's a agriculture department has a loan guarantee program called the CCC program. Eventually, the U.S. provided $5 billion of loan guarantees to Iraq to buy U.S. agricultural goods. The Bush administration did this over the objections of 4 agencies, which didn't want to go through with the program for a number of reasons, ranging from the fact that it was unlikely that Iraq would be able to repay the loans, and in fact, after the end of the war, or after the invasion of Kuwait, Iraq owed us $2 billion. We haven't seen that $2 billion. We'll never see that $2 billion probably. But more importantly, the U.S. law enforcement agencies had determined or had uncovered evidence that some of the money for this program was being diverted. There was a diversion by the Iraqis to purchase arms, and also, more incredibly, to funds were diverted for Iraq's nuclear program. And these warnings were brought to the personal attention of Secretary of State Baker, then Secretary of State Baker, and his top aides. And despite that, Baker and Bush continued with this $5 billion loan guarantee program. They pressed their subordinates and other agencies to provide an additional $1 billion in the fall of 1989 less than a year before Iraq invaded Kuwait. The most serious issue is, or assistance, it's not the most important assistance, but it's important because of the potential violation of law. But that is that George Bush was one of a number of officials who supported and authorized an effort to arm Iraq by having U.S. arms and munitions transferred from the original country we sent it to, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Kuwait. George Bush personally authorized U.S. arms sent to these countries to then be transferred to Iraq. Now, that's just not covert policy. There's something called there's a statute called the Arms Export Control Act, and that states that arms cannot be retransferred. U.S. arms and munitions cannot be retransferred from one country to another without the written authorization by the U.S. and also notification to Congress. And these arms transfers were authorized by Bush and other officials, despite the fact that there was no written authorization nor notification of Congress. They were outside the law. The arms transfers broke the law. And that's just an outright disregard for the rule of law. It's an outright disregard for our constitutional system. It was acting outside the normal mechanisms of constitutional government, just like we saw in Iran-Contra.
What kinds of technology were being facilitated by U.S. corporations, and which corporations were involved in this?
We had one corporation, one company in Alabama had a $27 million contract, built an entire factory at an Iraqi nuclear complex with the full knowledge of the CIA, despite the fact that federal law enforcement officials learned what the firm was doing during a criminal investigation of the Banco Nacional del Oro. And the amount of, altogether, the Reagan and Bush administrations allowed for the export of $1.5 billion worth of what we call dual-use technology and goods. And that's technology and goods that can be used for civilian purposes, but also for military purposes. They can build munitions, chemical weapons, ballistic missiles, and even be used to produce a bomb. And over the objections of a number of agencies, and despite some very contentious debate, the Bush administration, the White House and the State Department always sided on those who wanted to send Saddam more.
Before we talk about perhaps the other part of this scandal, which is still unfolding, even though George Bush is no longer president, that's the cover-up. George Bush continues to maintain that all he was doing is following policy that was instituted by Ronald Reagan, which was in the best interests of the United States government in terms of creating a balance between Iraq and Iran.
What actually happened was George Bush increased economic assistance to Iraq, brought the U.S. and Iraq closer, and all the various covert and overt programs to assist Saddam Hussein were increased and but substantially during the Bush administration. It went way beyond anything the Reagan administration did. But there's also another differentiation. The Reagan administration's assistance to Iraq until a ceasefire between Iran and Iraq that ended the Iran-Iraq war. At one point, we supported Iraq because we were afraid that Iran, the Ayatollah Khomeini, would win the war, that the Ayatollah Khomeini would not only control his own country, but also control Iraq. And we kind of had almost the domino theory that we had with Vietnam. Once Iraq fell, Saudi Arabia would fall, Kuwait would fall, the Ayatollah Khomeini, and a new spate of Islamic fundamentalist extremists would then control our foreign oil, and this would be a major national security threat. So the Reagan administration policy was at least had the rationale of we have to do business with Saddam to stop a more brutal dictator and one who is a more serious threat to U.S. national security interests, the Ayatollah Khomeini. Once the war ends, there were a number of officials in the Reagan administration, top officials, who said, let's reappraise our policy. Should we continue our support for Saddam? Do we need to? Do we really need to counter the Ayatollah? We did when the war was going on. We didn't now. So there's a major change. There's a turning point when people question the policy. And George Bush himself, or when we wrote one of the first articles in the Los Angeles Times about Iraqgate, or what's become known as Iraqgate, Bush pointed that out. Yes, I did do things to help Saddam Hussein, but as you recall, we had a far more formidable and dangerous foe in the region, who was the Ayatollah Khomeini, and I'm proud of what I quite did. He's never fully explained why the policy continued long after the Iran-Iraq war ended, after the Ayatollah ceased being such a threat, and then when he became president, why he increased the assistance and aid, both covert and overt.
Dennis Bernstein, we're speaking with Murray Waas, who's a special correspondent for the Los Angeles Times, wrote many stories for the Times, and co-wrote an article for the New Yorker magazine on what has now come to be called Iraqgate. Marray Waas, is it credible to you that, as it stands now, some very minor bank officials in Atlanta have been indicted for the scandal? We haven't heard much more than a man by the name of, I believe it's Christopher Dragul, who has indicted a few other people. Does that make sense? Is that where the buck should stop? Was this man the one who was in charge, or do you see this as a larger problem?
It was part of a B&L. The bank was really assisting something called the Iraqi Procurement Network, which was a clandestine worldwide procurement network set up by Saddam Hussein's son-in-law to obtain billions of dollars of arms and technology to build nuclear weapons, ballistic missiles, and the bank was one component of that. The evidence is that the Bush administration adopted a number of policy initiatives and took a number of actions that assisted this procurement network in obtaining arms and technology, and the bank was basically played the role of financing some of those deals. And so there's even a larger issue of not just whether the Bush administration allowed the activities of this bank, but what the bank was part of, this procurement network that we allowed. When one interesting thing was when George Bush went on national television to announce that the air war had begun and the U.S. was now at war with Iraq, he said there would be some out there who criticize our action, but I'd like to remind them that every day we don't act, Saddam Hussein comes that much closer to having an atomic weapon. The irony of that statement, the paradox, is simply that it was the Bush administration policy of exporting dual-use technology, allowing this procurement network to operate, not taking a stronger, stopping the efforts of B&L, that really allowed Iraq to come close to developing a nuclear weapon. We were basically stopping our own bad deed.
For some time now, House Banking Chairman Henry Gonzalez has been investigating this B&L scandal, what we're calling Iraqgate. The administration, he's been threatened by the CIA, who's accused him of of releasing state secrets. It's been suggested by the former Attorney General that he was undermining U.S. national security. Do you think that those were legitimate claims against Gonzalez for his revelations, or do you believe that there is a full-fledged cover-up going on here, and what indication do you have if you think there is?
There's a massive cover-up. There's a cover-up because there's a number of because there's an embarrassment about a failed policy that perhaps propelled the United States into war. There was political fallout during the election, and there's also evidence of criminality. So there's good reason for the cover-up. As far as any national security secrets being revealed, Larry Eagleburger made those charges against the Los Angeles Times. He made the same charge against Congressman Gonzalez. and he's asked, I think it was by Congressman Barney Frank at a hearing, can you name one example of one document that had some impact on national security, can you give us just one example from the dozens of newspaper articles or from all that Congressman Gonzalez did? And the then Deputy Secretary of State, later Secretary of State, Eagleberger, responded that he couldn't. But he would try and find out, get back to the committee, and give them examples. He never did, he never has, and there's been this general allegation that they've made that this stuff has compromised national security, but when pinned down and asked for specifics, they've taken the fifth.
Okay, who do you think may be culpable in terms of a cover-up or illegal policy, and why?
I think we have George Bush and his national security advisor authorizing arms sales, arms transfers to Iraq that are out that violate the Arms Export Control Act. It starts with the president.
What about James Baker? You mentioned James Baker, Lawrence Eagleberger. What about Clayton Yeutter, the former Secretary of Agriculture?
Clayton Yeutter, the Secretary of Agriculture, reversed a decision that his own department made not to give additional loan guarantees to Iraq. At one point, the Agriculture Department said no more money for Iraq. James Baker was told about this, and according to a document, said, "I want it back on the table." He called Clayton Yeutter, and according to the talking points of Baker, Baker told Yeutter that he wanted this done because of, quote, foreign policy concerns and to improve the quote, bilateral relationship between the U.S. and Iraq. Not long after that, the Senate Agriculture Committee Chairman Patrick Leahy wrote to Yeutter saying he had heard rumors that we were giving these agricultural loan guarantees and continuing the $1 billion because it was part of a foreign policy. And Clayton Yeutter wrote a letter back saying, I can assure you there were no foreign policy concerns here. It had nothing to do with foreign policy, when in fact it did. So we have the issue of whether Clayton Yeutter lied to Congress to cover up a covert foreign policy, just like we saw so many officials of the Reagan administration lie about the Iran policy to Congress.
And finally, Murray Waas, I'd like to talk to you about the human costs, the financial costs, and the real human costs. How do you see that? Because oftentimes these scandals are considered as policy disputes between one branch of government or another, or between the Republicans or the Democrats. So what do you see the real costs of this kind of policy and action?
We see an attack on the whole idea of constitutional government. There are foreign policy disputes, but there are mechanisms within a constitutional system to resolve them. There is open debate in Congress. There's debate and involvement by the public. There are checks and balances, and these are prescribed in the Constitution. What we have here is setting that all aside. We have these officials saying we're going to do what we want when we want to do it. We don't care if it's outside the law. We don't care if Congress knows. A lot of the American people. And so you have the American people cut out of determining their future, being involved in their own democratic process, and so this is perhaps the most massive assault on constitutional democracy we've seen since Watergate, and I think it can be argued it's much worse than Watergate. Watergate was a president involved in political crimes, and then covering up those political crimes. Iran-Contra, Iraqgate. These are crimes that are more central to the Constitution itself. They're more like the high crimes and misdemeanors that the founders wrote about when they talked about impeachment of a president. President should act within the Constitution and should act within the law. When Bill Clinton took the oath of office not too long ago, he made only one promise, and that was to uphold, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. And by putting aside the rule of law and Constitution, both Ronald Reagan and George Bush broke that promise. And that is the most important promise that a president can make, because that is the thing that assures the perpetuity of constitutional government.
And finally, do you think that this policy led to the loss of life in any way? Does this stimulate war? Is there a problem?
There were two factions within the Reagan administration. One supported Iran and one supported Iraq. Both encouraged arms sales to both sides. Both encouraged assistance. And what we saw was an escalation of one of the bloodiest wars that we've seen in the world's history. I think 1 million dead on both sides. Instead of being a peacemaker, we exacerbated the situation. We made it worse through our covert policies. Civilian casualties were enormous. What we wrote about in the New Yorker article was one episode where George Bush went to the Middle East and, using President Mubarak of Egypt and King Hussein of Jordan as intermediaries, counseled and advised Saddam Hussein to more aggressively use his air force against Iran, to actually send Iraqi jets into the interior of Iran and bomb more aggressively. The reason for that, we wrote, based on classified documents and interviews, was that this was a means, once Iraq was more aggressive against Iran, Iran would then need our air weapons, air defense weapon and systems, and would come back to the negotiating table to deal for the hostages. So in an effort to get a few hostages home, an effort that turned out to be as effective as something that the Keystone Cops could have done, because it didn't really get any more hostages home and only got more taken, Saddam Hussein did indeed escalate the bombing of Iran. Iran retaliated. The war was much more bloodier. It went on longer than it should have. And civilian casualties escalated to a degree that hadn't occurred before this trip, really.
And some would also say that that Iraq's invasion of Kuwait was stimulated, encouraged by this policy that we're talking about.
Well, we gave Saddam Hussein that military. We gave him $5 billion in agricultural loan guarantees, which freed up other hard currency to buy arms. We knew allegations that some of that $5 billion was being diverted to purchase arms and technology. We ignored it. We allowed it to continue. We provided other economic assistance to Iraq, which allowed it to build up its military. We arranged arms shipments to Iraq through third countries. But most importantly of all, we engaged in a policy that acquiesced and encouraged this massive procurement network, clandestine worldwide Iraqi procurement network, that spent $30 billion on unconventional arms, what the president would later call weapons of mass destruction. And so we helped give him the arsenal to invade Kuwait and then use against our own troops.
Thanks, Murray Waas.